It was June 6, 1944. Dawn broke over the coast of Normandy with an eerie calm that wouldn't last long. Along the French shoreline, German soldiers stationed in their concrete bunkers shared cigarettes, cracked jokes, and watched the grey horizon. To them, this was just another morning in occupied France. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's impenetrable defense, stood before them, armed with machine guns, mortars, and miles of barbed wire. They had faith in their fortifications, and they laughed at the thought that any army would dare to attack head-on. But as the first shadows of Allied ships appeared through the mist, their laughter faded. Within minutes, that calm morning transformed into chaos. The greatest amphibious invasion in history had begun, Operation Overlord. Thousands of Allied soldiers were pouring toward the beaches under a hail of gunfire. The Germans, who had spent months believing they were untouchable, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by a storm of steel, fire, and courage. This is the story of that morning, of the defenders who mocked the approaching fleet until the sky darkened with planes and the ground trembled with explosions. It's a story not only of strategy and warfare, but of shock, fear, and the moment when human arrogance collided with the unstoppable tide of history. In this cinematic World War II documentary, we'll revisit the German soldiers' perspective on D-Day, their disbelief, their panic, and their realization that the war had truly come to their doorstep. Through historical accounts, soldier testimonies, and vivid storytelling, witness how laughter on the cliffs of Normandy turned into screams that echoed across the beaches, changing the course of World War II forever. The days before the Allied invasion were deceptively quiet along the French coast. For months, German soldiers had manned their positions along Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile defensive network stretching from Norway to Spain. They had grown accustomed to the monotony of guard duty, endless patrols, cleaning weapons, and staring across the grey expanse of the English Channel. In their minds, this coastline was impenetrable. The Führer himself had declared it would be impossible for the Allies to land a single division on French soil. And so, even though rumours of invasion had spread through the ranks for weeks, most of the men stationed there dismissed them as yet another false alarm. Inside the bunkers overlooking Normandy's beaches, soldiers smoked, laughed, and swapped stories about home. Some were veterans of the brutal Eastern Front, hardened men who had survived the snows of Russia. Others were teenagers from across occupied Europe, thrust into a war they barely understood. The older soldiers teased them, calling them children of the Atlantic Wall. To these young recruits, the threat of an invasion seemed distant, almost absurd. The weather was bad, the sea rough, and the wind howled across the coast. No one in their right mind would attempt an amphibious landing under such conditions, they told each other with confidence. At the command posts, officers shared the same complacency. Intelligence reports from German high command had been clear. The Allies would strike at Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, not Normandy. Every strategic map, every analysis pointed to that conclusion. The deception campaign known as Operation Fortitude had worked flawlessly, convincing the Germans that Normandy was only a diversion. So the soldiers stationed there, the ones who would soon face the fury of D-Day, believed they were safe. Some even mocked the constant alerts, saying that British and American propaganda exaggerated their strength. The night before the invasion, June 5th, passed without incident. Rain lashed the coast. The wind screamed through the gun emplacements. Many soldiers retreated into their bunkers, grateful for the warmth of their rations and the comfort of routine. A few wrote letters home by candlelight, speaking of boredom more than fear. One diary entry found after the war described the mood perfectly. We were tired, cold, and waiting for nothing. The sea was angry, the sky black. There would be no invasion tonight. Meanwhile, across the Channel, more than 5,000 ships were gathering. In England's harbours, the largest invasion force in history was already preparing to cross the sea. Thousands of soldiers prayed, checked their weapons, and looked toward France with a mixture of dread and determination. Yet on the other side, the German soldiers slept, unaware that by dawn the Channel would be filled with thunder. As midnight passed, the coastal batteries fell silent except for the rhythm of the waves. The defenders' laughter echoed through the cold concrete halls, oblivious to the storm that would soon descend upon them. In a few short hours, that laughter would turn to confusion, disbelief, and sheer terror. as history's greatest invasion force arrived on their doorstep. It began quietly, a faint vibration in the distance, a sound so deep it was almost felt more than heard. Around 3 a.m., German radar operators stationed along the Normandy coast began noticing strange patterns on their screens. Blips appeared, then disappeared as if something vast but fragmented was moving across the channel. The young operator at one station, his face pale in the dim green glow, hesitated before reporting it to his superior. "Probably another storm," the officer muttered. "Nothing moves in weather like this." He was wrong. Beyond the waves stretching from horizon to horizon, thousands of Allied ships were advancing under cover of darkness. The largest armada in human history was coming straight for them. At first, the Germans thought it was a diversion. The British had been clever before, sending false signals, dummy tanks, even fake paratroopers made of cloth. Their commanders had grown accustomed to such tricks. But as the early hours passed, more and more reports began to pour in. Patrol boats spotted silhouettes in the mist. Coastal lookouts swore they could hear engines rumbling across the water. Still, disbelief lingered. The headquarters at Caen and Paris dismissed the alarms as exaggerated. One officer reportedly joked, "Perhaps the English are practicing for the real invasion." By 4:30 a.m., the truth began to emerge. The sea was alive with movement, hundreds of landing craft pushing through the waves, destroyers and battleships pounding the coastline with relentless artillery fire. The night sky, once silent, suddenly flashed with light. The thunder of naval guns rolled across the beaches, shaking the very earth beneath the German bunkers. Inside those fortifications, chaos erupted. Men leapt from their bunks, scrambling for helmets and rifles. Dust filled the air as concrete trembled under the impact of shells. The air reeked of gunpowder and smoke. Shouts echoed through the corridors, orders, prayers, and the deafening roar of explosions. One soldier, manning a machine gun on the cliffs, later recalled the moment the bombardment began. The whole sky turned red. The sea was on fire. We thought the world was ending. For many of them, it was the first time they truly felt the might of the Allied war machine. The naval barrage tore through pillboxes and gun nests, flattening positions that had taken months to build. The German defenders had been told their concrete walls were indestructible. But now, under the unrelenting shelling, cracks began to appear, both in the bunkers and in their confidence. By dawn, reports were flooding in from every sector. Enemy landing craft approaching the beaches. Infantry sighted on the waterline. "We are under heavy bombardment." Radio operators screamed for reinforcements, but command was paralyzed. Confusion spread as communication lines failed and power flickered in the bunkers. When the mist began to clear, the defenders finally saw it, the sight that froze their blood. The sea was filled with ships. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Warships, troop carriers, and landing craft as far as the eye could see. What had once seemed impossible was now undeniable. The invasion had begun, and the Germans were facing it alone. When the first Allied landing craft scraped against the beaches at 6:30 a.m., the world seemed to explode. The Germans, still disoriented from hours of naval bombardment, scrambled to their positions as the roar of machine guns filled the air. From the cliffs above Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Sword and Gold beaches, the defenders opened fire with everything they had. Tracer rounds cut through the morning mist, the smell of salt and gunpowder mixed into a choking haze, and the beaches became a killing ground. Yet even as they fired, many German soldiers were in disbelief. The scale of what they were seeing was beyond anything they had imagined. Through the fog, they could see thousands of men wading ashore, some already falling, others pressing forward into the storm of bullets. Allied tanks struggled to land, many sinking before they even reached the sand. Landing craft were blown apart by artillery, bodies scattered across the tide. The Germans had been told the Allies were weak, that their soldiers lacked discipline and courage. But as they watched the men continue to charge through waves of fire, crawling through the surf, dragging wounded comrades and advancing inch by inch, a chilling realization began to set in. The enemy wasn't breaking. They were coming and nothing would stop them. Inside the German strongpoints, the situation was desperate. Ammunition belts jammed with sand, gun barrels overheated, and the relentless bombardment had cut off resupply routes. Still, the defenders fought fiercely, clinging to every advantage their elevated positions offered. They could see the Allied officers shouting orders, the medics risking their lives to tend to the wounded, and the landing craft returning again and again. The sea was boiling with motion, a wall of men and metal crashing against the shore. One German machine gunner later said, "We kept firing, but they kept coming." It was like shooting at the sea itself. The screams of the wounded mixed with the whine of aircraft overhead as Allied bombers swooped in, targeting the German emplacements. The very ground seemed to tremble as explosions tore through the fortifications. Sandbags and steel fragments flew through the air, knocking soldiers off their feet. Men shouted in terror as the sky filled with smoke and falling debris. Officers tried to rally their troops, but communication was impossible. Telephone lines were destroyed and radio channels jammed. Entire units were isolated, fighting blind against a force that seemed to stretch to the horizon. From their vantage points, German soldiers began to understand what was happening. This wasn't a raid. It wasn't a diversion. This was a full-scale invasion, the beginning of the end. The Allies were everywhere, storming the beaches, parachuting inland, and closing in from every direction. The laughter and confidence that had filled the German positions just hours earlier had vanished completely. In its place came fear, disbelief, and the grim realization that the Reich's impenetrable wall was collapsing under the weight of an army unlike any they had ever faced. Inside the bunkers, the world had turned into a suffocating hell. The walls, once thought indestructible, shook with each hit from Allied shells. The constant pounding was deafening, a low, endless thunder that rattled every bone in the body. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the acrid smell of burning oil. Soldiers shouted to be heard over the roar, their voices hoarse with panic. Orders were drowned out by explosions, and many bunkers were plunged into darkness as power lines were severed. For those trapped inside, the sense of isolation was crushing. They had no clear view of the battlefield, no contact with higher command, only the sounds of chaos and the knowledge that the enemy was getting closer. Some tried to remain composed, clinging to their training. They loaded belts of ammunition, checked their weapons, and peered through narrow slits in the concrete to catch glimpses of the carnage outside. But what they saw was beyond comprehension. Waves of soldiers advancing through the smoke, Allied tanks forcing their way up the beach, and aircraft circling overhead like hawks. For the first time, the Germans inside the bunkers realized they were fighting a war that could not be won from inside a fortress. Every instinct screamed for them to flee, yet there was nowhere to run. The entrances were blocked by rubble or fire, and outside waited an army determined to break through. The sensory overload was unbearable. The explosions blended into one continuous roar, and the vibration of the ground made it feel as though the world itself was collapsing. One German officer later described it as fighting inside an earthquake. Men stumbled through the smoke, coughing, blinded, ears ringing. Some shouted prayers, others cursed, and some simply froze, paralyzed by fear. Every minute felt like an eternity. Even the most battle-hardened veterans, men who had survived the frozen fields of Stalingrad, found themselves shaken by the scale of destruction. Then came the unmistakable sound of Allied boots on sand and gravel. The invasion force had reached the bunkers. Grenades were tossed through firing slits, shattering the interiors with concussive blasts. The defenders fought back desperately, firing through narrow openings, but their fields of view were limited and their ammunition was dwindling. The concrete chambers that had once offered safety were now death traps. Too small to maneuver in, too loud to think, too fragile to protect them. Some soldiers tried to escape through the rear exits, only to be met with rifle fire or capture. Those who survived would later describe the moment of realization, the instant they understood that the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's great defensive dream, had failed completely. They had been told it could withstand anything, that the Allies would be slaughtered before reaching the shore. Yet now, standing in shattered bunkers surrounded by enemy fire, that illusion was gone. Their pride, their confidence, even their faith in the war itself was crumbling with the concrete above their heads. What had begun as a morning of routine duty had turned into a fight for survival. And the laughter of the night before was nothing but a haunting memory drowned in the thunder of invasion. By midday, the battle that had begun in confusion and disbelief had turned into a full-scale collapse for the German defenders. The beaches that had been so heavily fortified were now broken landscapes of craters, smoke, and twisted steel. The once proud fortifications of the Atlantic Wall were reduced to rubble, and the defenders who had survived the morning's onslaught were exhausted, deafened, and leaderless. Communication with higher command had completely disintegrated. Field telephones were destroyed, radio operators were dead or captured, and orders from the regional command never arrived. Each unit was fighting its own private war, blind and desperate, clinging to survival rather than strategy. In the chaos, many German officers attempted to rally their men, but confusion reigned. Some still believed reinforcements would come, that panzer divisions stationed inland would soon arrive to push the Allies back into the sea. But those divisions never came. Field Marshal Rommel, the commander responsible for defending the French coast, was not even in France that morning. He had returned to Germany to visit his wife for her birthday, convinced that poor weather meant no invasion would occur. His absence, along with the paralysis of the German command structure, left frontline soldiers completely abandoned. Meanwhile, the Allies were gaining ground rapidly. Despite horrific casualties, they had established a foothold on several beaches. Tanks were now rolling off landing craft, engineers were clearing mines and obstacles, and medics were setting up makeshift hospitals right on the sand. From their shattered bunkers, the Germans watched in disbelief as the invaders kept coming, endless waves of soldiers, equipment, and supplies. The air above was thick with Allied aircraft, strafing retreating German positions and bombing roads to cut off reinforcements. The sky and sea belonged entirely to the Allies. In the nearby French villages, terrified civilians huddled in basements as the ground trembled from artillery fire. Some peeked through cracks in the shutters, seeing German soldiers retreating in disarray, while others marched into captivity, their weapons thrown aside. To many French citizens, it was the first sign that liberation had truly come. For the Germans, however, it was the moment they realized the nightmare had only begun. Those who could flee tried to regroup inland, but the advancing Allied forces gave them no chance. The once boastful talk of the Atlantic Wall being impenetrable was gone. German soldiers, coated in dust and blood, staggered through the smoke like ghosts. Some surrendered willingly, their nerves shattered. Others refused to believe what was happening, fighting to the last round in a hopeless attempt to delay the inevitable. There was no organized resistance left, only scattered groups of men trying to survive as the tide of war swept over them. By the afternoon, the defenders' laughter, so full of arrogance just hours earlier, had been replaced by screams, cries for help, and the silence of defeat. The Allied forces had done the impossible. They had breached the wall that was never meant to fall. And for the German soldiers who survived, the horror of that day would stay with them forever, etched in their memories as the moment when invincibility turned to ruin. As the sun set over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the smoke began to settle, but the silence that followed was not peace, it was exhaustion. The beaches, once pristine stretches of sand, had become graveyards of men and machines. The tide washed over wrecked landing craft, tangled barbed wire, and lifeless bodies. For the German soldiers who survived the day, the sense of shock was overwhelming. They had entered the morning confident in their fortifications, laughing at the thought that anyone would dare to attack their positions. Now they stood among ruins surrounded by the dead, facing a truth they had never imagined possible. The war was no longer theirs to win. Those captured in the hours following the invasion were dazed, disoriented, and strangely quiet. Many had been awake for more than 30 hours, their nerves shattered by the bombardment and fighting. Allied troops who took them prisoner noted that most seemed stunned rather than defiant. They had been told that the Atlantic Wall was invincible, that no enemy could cross the channel under fire. Yet as they marched past the wreckage of their own guns, they saw that belief reduced to rubble. Some wept openly, not just from fear but from disbelief. For years they had been told the German Reich would last 1,000 years. Now standing on the beaches of Normandy, they could feel it collapsing beneath their boots. In the command bunkers far behind the lines, German officers tried to make sense of the disaster. Reports were fragmented, chaotic. Entire divisions had vanished, communications were down, and reinforcements were blocked by Allied air superiority. The front that was supposed to protect Western Europe had crumbled in a single day. It was the beginning of a retreat that would never stop until Berlin itself fell less than a year later. For the Allies, the victory came at a terrible cost. Over 10,000 men were killed, wounded or missing on that first day alone. The beaches were littered with the consequences of heroism and horror alike. Yet, the success of D-Day marked a turning point that changed the course of the Second World War. It opened the gateway to Europe, allowing Allied forces to begin their long, grinding push toward liberation and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. But for the German soldiers who had fought and survived that day, the memory never left them. Many would later recall the eerie quiet that followed the battle, the cries of the wounded carried by the wind, the waves washing over the fallen, and the smell of gunpowder still heavy in the air. They had believed in their strength, in their walls, and in the promises of their leaders. Now they stood defeated not just by an enemy army, but by the truth that had been hidden from them, that courage, unity, and purpose had come together in a force far greater than their pride. That evening, as darkness returned to Normandy, the laughter that had begun the day was long gone. In its place was the haunting silence of realization that the war was turning and Germany's era of conquest was over.